At a rundown auction in rural Kentucky, folks laughed and jeered at a scrawny, scarred raccoon, calling it worthless trash. Then a young man stood up and claimed the creature no one else wanted. From that moment, their lives twisted down a road no one expected, filled with mischief, danger, dark secrets, and finally, a miracle that would be remembered as chance. The auction barn in the hills of Kentucky smelled of damp straw, rusted metal, and old tobacco smoke. Folks gathered on creaking wooden benches, their voices carrying a mix of boredom and cruel amusement. In the center of the floor sat a cage that had seen better days, its bars bent and its lock half broken. Inside, a raccoon crouched low, ribs showing through its matted fur, eyes dull from hunger and fear. One of the men in the back laughed, nudging his neighbor. "Ain't worth a dime." "Mean little trash bandit," another voice added. "Better off put down than wasting space here." The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice cracking with desperation. "We'll start at $10. $10 for this animal, last chance before she's sent off." The crowd chuckled, heads shaking. It was clear no one wanted the creature. To them, it was nothing but trouble, a nuisance that raided garbage bins and hissed at children. The raccoon pressed itself tighter against the back of the cage as the laughter rose, as if it understood it was being mocked. Then a chair scraped against the dusty floorboards. From the back row, a young man stood. His clothes were plain: denim jacket, worn boots, a carpenter's belt still hanging at his side from the day's work. His face was lean, shadowed with the kind of tiredness that doesn't come from labor alone, but from grief that never quite lifts. His name was Luke Harris, 23 years old, and life had already dealt him more blows than most men twice his age. He'd buried his father the year before, and since then had been struggling to keep the family's old woodworking shop alive. Luke's voice was steady when he spoke, though there was something raw under the surface. "I'll take it." The room fell into silence. Heads turned, mouths hung open. The auctioneer blinked in surprise, as if he hadn't expected anyone to answer. Then laughter rippled through the barn once more, sharper now, directed not at the raccoon, but at the young man who had just spoken. "That boy done lost his mind," someone muttered. "Buying a pest instead of letting the county handle it." But Luke didn't flinch. He walked down the aisle, pulled a crumpled billfold from his pocket, and laid the money on the table. The auctioneer, still stunned, scribbled a receipt and pushed it toward him. "She's yours now." "Don't say I didn't warn you." When Luke knelt by the cage, the raccoon's eyes met his for the first time. They weren't just the eyes of a wild animal. There was something haunted there, a flicker of pain and suspicion that Luke recognized all too well. He had seen that same look in his own reflection after sleepless nights, nights spent wondering if his father's death had left him too broken to carry on. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "You're not trash. You're just lost, same as me." The raccoon hissed, lips curling back, but it didn't lunge. Instead, it held still, watching him with a wary intensity. Luke lifted the cage, heavier than he expected, and carried it out into the fading daylight. Behind him, the barn buzzed with ridicule, yet none of it seemed to touch him. His boots crunched against the gravel as he walked to his old pickup, the rusty tailgate dropping with a groan when he set the cage in the back. The drive home wound through quiet country roads lined with sycamore trees and rolling hills turned gold by late autumn sun. Luke kept glancing in the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of the raccoon pressed into the corner of the cage. The animal didn't move, didn't eat the scraps of bread he had left inside, just stared out with a look that gnawed at Luke's heart. By the time he reached the old farmhouse, the sky was painted with streaks of purple and orange. The place had once been full of life, his father's laughter echoing through the shop, where wooden chairs, tables, and cabinets had been crafted by hand. Now it stood quiet, the smell of sawdust faint under the dust of neglect. Luke carried the cage onto the porch and set it down gently. "You're safe here," he murmured. "At least safer than where you were." He unlatched the cage door, stepping back to give the animal space. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden burst, the raccoon darted out, claws scratching against the wooden boards, only to freeze at the edge of the porch. Its nose twitched, testing the air. The world outside was wide, but something kept it from running. Instead, it crouched low, glaring at Luke as though daring him to come closer. Luke sank onto the porch steps, weary from more than the day's work. He didn't try to reach out, didn't force anything. He just sat there in the twilight, his hands resting on his knees, and spoke quietly. "You don't owe me trust. Not yet, but you're not alone anymore." The raccoon gave a soft, uncertain chitter, its ringed tail curling tight around its body. It wasn't surrender, not by a long shot, but it wasn't rejection either. And for Luke, that was enough to believe maybe, just maybe, this strange twist of fate had brought him exactly what he needed. A chance to heal, wrapped in fur and scars, sitting stubbornly on his porch. And so, in that hushed evening light, a bond neither of them yet understood began to take root. The farmhouse creaked like an old man's knees when Luke pushed the front door open that night. Dust hung in the air, and the faint smell of pine from boards long since cut still clung to the rafters. He set his toolbox on the kitchen table, then turned back to check on his new companion. The raccoon had followed him only as far as the porch, sitting near the steps with its ringed tail wrapped tight around itself, eyes glinting under the porch light. Luke sighed. "Suit yourself," he muttered. He set down a dish of water and a small bowl of leftover stew just inside the door, then left it be. The raccoon didn't move while he washed up, didn't move when he stoked the wood stove to life. But later, when Luke returned, the bowl was licked clean, tipped on its side as if someone had tested whether it could be carried away. He smiled, shaking his head. "So you've got some mischief in you after all." By morning, the porch told another story. The trash can had been overturned, potato peels scattered across the steps, and an old boot dragged halfway down the yard. Luke chuckled despite himself. "Guess I can't say I wasn't warned." The raccoon sat on the railing, smug and bright-eyed, as if daring him to chase it. For the first time since his father's death, Luke laughed out loud. It felt strange in his chest, but good. The sound carried across the property, reaching the ears of old Ben Walker next door. Ben had lived in those hills longer than Luke had been alive, a wiry man with a sharp tongue and a hunter's eye. He leaned on the fence, arms crossed, when Luke came out to gather the mess. "Boy," Ben called, "you gone and lost your senses. Raccoons ain't pets. They'll rob you blind before you can say supper's ready." Luke bent to pick up the boot, brushing off the dirt. "Maybe," he said. "But she's here now," Ben snorted, shaking his head. "That animal'll tear your place apart. You mark my words. Should have left it where it was." His gaze softened for just a moment, as if he wanted to say more, then he spat on the ground and turned away. "Don't come crying to me when it bites you." Luke watched him go, the raccoon's eyes following too. There was a strange intelligence in the way it tracked Ben's retreat, like it understood the judgment being passed down. Later that day, while Luke worked in the old woodworking shed, he heard the unmistakable sound of wood clattering. He rushed back to the house to find the raccoon halfway up the pantry shelves, tiny paws prying at a jar lid. "Hey!" Luke barked, though his voice carried more surprise than anger. The raccoon froze, jar in hand, then deliberately tipped it, sending dried beans spilling across the floor. It skittered down and darted under the table, popping its masked head out just far enough to watch Luke's reaction. "You little bandit," Luke muttered, crouching to scoop up beans. The raccoon churred, a sound halfway between a laugh and a growl. Mischief danced in its eyes. Luke realized then that the animal wasn't just wild. It was testing him, measuring his patience. That night, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Luke sat at the kitchen table with his supper. Across from him, perched on the chair like an uninvited guest, sat the raccoon. It had climbed up silently, paws resting on the table's edge, nose twitching at the smell of cornbread. Luke broke off a piece and set it on the plate between them. The raccoon leaned forward, snatched it, and retreated to the chair's corner. For a few minutes, they ate together in silence, man and beast, the old house holding them both in its quiet embrace. The fragile peace didn't last. A knock sounded on the door, sharp and deliberate. Luke opened it to find a uniformed figure standing in the lantern glow. Sheriff Miller, broad-shouldered and solemn, his badge catching the light. "Evening, Luke," the sheriff said. His eyes shifted to the raccoon sitting plain as day at the table behind Luke. "Heard you picked up something unusual at the auction." Luke stiffened. "Just a raccoon, Sheriff, nothing more." Miller's gaze lingered on the animal, who stared back unflinching, crumbs of cornbread still clinging to its whiskers. "That one's been passed around before. Word is, it came out of a place best left unmentioned. You'd do well to keep an eye open." Luke frowned. "What do you mean?" The sheriff shook his head. "Not a story for tonight. Just be careful. Some critters carry more than fleas." He tipped his hat and walked into the darkness, leaving Luke uneasy. When Luke closed the door, he found the raccoon on the counter, pawing at the oil lamp as if trying to douse the flame. He caught the animal mid-swipe, their eyes locking. In that moment, Luke felt something strange, like the raccoon knew more than it should, like it had lived through things no creature ought to endure. He let out a long breath. "You're trouble," he whispered, "but maybe you're my kind of trouble." The raccoon tilted its head, gave a quiet chitter, and curled up on the counter as if claiming its place. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, and the old house groaned. But inside, for the first time in a long while, Luke didn't feel so alone. Morning came soft and blue over the hills, and the farmhouse woke with the slow patience of a place that's seen more seasons than it cares to count. Luke brewed coffee on the stove, the kettle's whistle cutting through the quiet. The raccoon, still nameless in his mind, though trouble kept trying to stick, sat on the back of a chair like a watchful little judge, paws folded under its chest, eyes bright as marbles. When Luke poured a splash of milk into a saucer, the critter slid down the chair leg and followed the saucer across the table as if it were a boat drifting on a calm river. A truck rolled up the drive, tires crunching gravel. Luke glanced out the window just as Emily Carter climbed down from the cab, ponytail sticking through the back of a faded ball cap. She waved with the easy confidence of somebody who'd known him since they were barefoot kids catching tadpoles. Emily was 2 years into her veterinary program and home on a short break, filling in at the clinic in town. "Brought you bandages and judgment," she said, stepping onto the porch with a grin. "Heard you adopted a pantry thief." Luke opened the door and stepped aside. "Careful. The pantry thief prefers cornbread and chaos." Emily's eyes landed on the raccoon, who had just that moment dipped its paw into the milk saucer, then licked each finger with dainty concentration. "Well now," she said softly, a note of surprise under the humor. "You are prettier up close, and skinnier." Her gaze sharpened. "May I?" The raccoon froze. Luke held his breath. Emily moved slow, like a prayer. No sudden reach, no direct stare. She slid the saucer a little closer, then sat on the floor with her knees bent and her hands in plain sight. The raccoon sniffed, looked to Luke, then to Emily again. It took a cautious step forward. When it was near enough to feel her breath, Emily tilted her head and murmured, "Aren't you a brave little bandit?" Only then did Luke see it. A narrow, bald seam low on the neck, hidden under the scruff. Not just a scar from wire or brush. Too clean, too deliberate. "You see it?" Emily asked without looking up. Luke nodded. "Thought it was an old cut." "Maybe," she said, "but I've seen surgical lines like that. Somebody put something there, or took something out." The raccoon pulled back as if it understood, then, like the devil himself had whispered an idea, darted sideways, snatched Emily's glove from where it stuck out of her back pocket, and took off like a kid playing keep-away. "Hey!" Emily laughed, scrambling to her feet. "Sir, that glove cost me exactly $8. Luke was already out the door. The raccoon shot across the porch railing, leapt to the rain barrel, and from there to the shed roof, landing with a thump that sent a puff of dust into the sun. It sat at the peak, glove drooping from its mouth like a trophy, tail curling and uncurling with pure delight. "Don't you dare jump to the chimney," Luke called, hand to his brow. "You'll get yourself stuck, and I'll have to explain that to the fire department." Emily shaded her eyes. "You want the glove, or should we frame him for burglary?" The raccoon, as if considering the charge, dropped the glove just far enough to catch it with one paw, then slapped it back between its teeth. It chittered, a throaty, mischievous sound, and tapped the shingles like a drummer warming up. "Okay," Emily said, laughter still in her voice. "Let's make a trade." She pulled a granola bar from her pocket, snapped it in half, and held a piece high. "I bet you can't resist oats and sugar." The raccoon sniffed the air, posture changing. It crouched, scooted forward, paw over paw, then stopped to test the balance of the roof with a delicate foot. Emily placed the granola on the porch railing and stepped back. For a long breath, nothing moved. Then the raccoon launched, clean and quick, landing on the rail with a wobble and a soft thud. It set the glove neatly on the banister, scooped the treat, and turned with a sideways look that could only be called smug. Luke shook his head, grinning despite himself. "You little con artist." He picked up the glove and passed it to Emily, who dusted it off and tucked it safely away. "We've got ourselves a negotiator," she said. "Smart as sin and twice as bold." They settled on the porch steps. The raccoon finished the granola, then wandered to a patch of sun and sprawled as if that had been the plan all along. Emily drew a small pen light from her bag, waited until the critter's eyes grew heavy, and eased closer. She didn't touch, only looked, careful, respectful. "That seems clean," she murmured. "No infection, but the edges tell me it's not from last week. Couple months, maybe. Whoever did it had steady hands, not backyard work." She tucked the light away and straightened up. "Luke, this wasn't just a snare or a fight. Somebody worked on this animal. On purpose." Luke felt the cool thread of Sheriff Miller's warning slide through his thoughts. Some critters carry more than fleas. He rubbed a thumb across the porch rail where years of hands had made the wood smooth. "Sheriff stopped by," he said slowly. "Hinted the raccoon had passed through a place nobody wanted to talk about." Emily's mouth hardened. "We've heard rumors at the clinic. Private outfits playing fast and loose with wildlife. Training that looks a lot like trouble. If this one came from there..." She let the sentence die. The raccoon yawned extravagantly, curled into itself, and, just to prove it still held the upper hand, rolled onto its back and covered its eyes with one paw. Emily chuckled. Luke did too, and the sound loosened something tight in his chest. Ben Walker wandered over about then, drawn by the sort of curiosity he liked to pretend he didn't have. He stood at the bottom of the steps, hat in hand. "Heard a ruckus," he said. "Looked like rooftop gymnastics from my kitchen window." Emily gestured to the dozing culprit. "Acrobatics by a professional." Ben's eyes found the scar almost at once. He went quiet, the hunter in him weighing what he saw. "That ain't from a fence," he said at last. "Nor trap." He looked at Luke, then at Emily. "Whatever you two think you got here, you best keep your heads on straight." "Planning on it," Luke said. Ben nodded once, as if a line had shifted a fraction in his mind, then hooked his thumb toward his place. "I've got extra lumber if you want to shore up that pantry, or a raccoon-proof trunk, which is to say, a trunk the raccoon ain't seen yet." After he left, the afternoon settled into the kind of quiet that feels solid. Luke worked in the shop, planing a stubborn board until curl after curl of cedar fell like ribbons. Emily took notes at the kitchen table, drawing little diagrams of the scar as if the act of understanding might offer protection. The raccoon drifted between them, a thread stitching house to shop, mischief to purpose. It investigated the broom, tried to climb the coat rack, and discovered the mirror with a start, puffing up and patting its own reflection as though greeting a rival. When it finally found the sunbeam under the window, it fit itself into the light like a puzzle piece that had traveled a long way to get home. Near dusk, Emily packed her bag. "I'll bring a scanner tomorrow," she said. "If there's a chip or anything foreign, we'll know." Luke walked her to the truck. Crickets had started, a thin silver music across the field. "Thanks, Em." She squeezed his arm. "You're doing right by this one. And Luke?" She tilted her head toward the house. "It's good to hear you laugh again." He stood there a while after she drove off, hands in his pockets, the sky turning the particular orange that used to mean his father would call him in from chores. He missed that voice. He missed a lot of things. But inside the house there was the clink of a pan lid being nudged open and a small, deliberate paw testing the worth of a biscuit. Life, in its sideways way, was moving again. When he stepped through the door, the raccoon froze on the counter, biscuit half swiped, eyes wide. Luke raised both palms. "All right, partner. Truce. You get the biscuit. I get my glove policy enforced." He reached for a second biscuit, broke it, and placed a piece on the floor. The critter hesitated, looked at the counter prize, looked at Luke, and made a decision a wiser creature might not have. It tucked the first biscuit under its chest like a miser with a coin, then hopped down to claim the second, too. It sat there between them, 2 biscuits and a look that said, plain as English, "I won." Luke laughed, really laughed, and leaned against the doorway until the laughter turned to a smile that felt less like a visitor and more like a tenant planning to stay. Later, while he washed dishes, the raccoon crept near, nose twitching, paws resting on the cabinet door. Luke wiped his hands and knelt. "You've got secrets," he said softly. "Scars that don't tell their whole story, but I reckon I've got a few of those myself." The raccoon inched forward, sniffed his sleeve, and touched his knuckles with the lightest tap, like a handshake from a shy neighbor. Then it climbed to the windowsill and watched the last of the light slide off the hills. In that room, in that hour, a puzzle began to turn. Pieces from the sheriff's warning and Emily's careful eyes and Ben's reluctant concern starting to click together. Nothing finished, nothing certain, but enough to feel the ground under his feet shift. Before bed, Luke set out a shallow box with an old quilt, half expecting to find it shredded by morning. The raccoon circled it once, twice, then, just to maintain the upper hand, climbed into Luke's empty work satchel instead and fell asleep with its head poking out, like a captain in a canvas boat. Luke turned down the lamp and stood in the doorway a long moment, listening to the soft house sounds, the slow breathing of a creature that had somehow sailed into his life and dropped anchor. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. "Whatever they did to you, whatever they want." The promise hung in the dark like a star you can steer by. Out in the yard, the wind carried a hint of rain, and far off, a pickup door slammed that didn't belong to any neighbor Luke knew. The raccoon stirred, ears twitching, then settled again. Tomorrow would bring questions and, with luck, answers. Tonight there was only the quilted hush of the old place, the scent of cedar and cornbread, and 2 souls, not so different, learning the shape of trust. The weather had been restless all day, the kind of heavy, pressing heat that makes the leaves turn their backs and the birds fall quiet. By evening, the air felt like wet wool, and thunder muttered over the ridges as if the mountains themselves were clearing their throats. Luke worked in the shop late, trying to finish a chair order he had promised, while the raccoon prowled the corners, curious about every nail and shaving of wood. The first crack of lightning sent the animal into a frenzy. It scrambled up the rafters, eyes wide, fur bristled, a sound halfway between a hiss and a cry spilling out of its mouth. Luke dropped his plane, wiping sawdust from his arms. "Easy now," he called, but the next thunderclap boomed like cannon fire. The raccoon bolted, claws scattering on the workbench, and disappeared through the open door into the night. "Damn it," Luke muttered, running after it. Rain began to pour in earnest, fat drops that slapped the dirt hard enough to make little craters. He grabbed a lantern from the porch, held it high, and shouted over the storm, "Come back, it's all right." But the raccoon was already gone, darting into the black tangle of trees. Luke pulled on his boots and followed, the lantern's glow bobbing across mud and roots. Branches clawed at his jacket, rain plastered his hair to his forehead, but he pressed on, calling into the night. The storm grew violent, wind howling through the hollows. He caught sight of movement, a flash of striped tail, then the sharp metallic snap of something closing. His heart dropped. The raccoon had stumbled into an old steel trap, half buried in the gully. It thrashed wildly, teeth snapping at the rain, leg clamped in the cruel jaws. The sound that came from it was not just pain but terror, a raw memory of every hand and cage that had hurt it before. Luke dropped to his knees in the mud, lantern rocking beside him. "Easy, buddy, easy," the raccoon hissed, lunging toward him, but the chain held it back. Its eyes were wild, unseeing. Lightning split the sky, white and merciless. Luke set the lantern aside and pushed his hands into the muck. The trapped teeth had cut skin, blood already dark against the fur. He forced the jaws apart with every ounce of strength he had, gritting his teeth as the metal bit into his palms. For a second it seemed hopeless. The spring wouldn't give, the raccoon snapped and clawed, the storm roared louder, but then, with a sharp click, the jaws released. The raccoon jerked free, tumbling back into the mud. It crouched low, panting, fur plastered, one paw held awkwardly. Luke leaned back, chest heaving. "I've got you," he said hoarsely. "You're all right now." For a moment neither moved. Rain drummed on the leaves, the lantern hissed faintly, and the two of them sat in the gully as if the world had narrowed to nothing else. Slowly, the raccoon inched forward. It didn't bite, didn't flee. Instead, it pressed against Luke's knee, trembling but not pulling away. Luke swallowed hard, blinking rain from his lashes. "You don't have to trust me all the way, but I won't leave you." He scooped the animal gently into his arms. It was lighter than it looked, bones sharp beneath wet fur. The raccoon gave a weak chitter, then buried its head against his chest as the storm rolled overhead. The walk back was slow. Luke stumbled more than once, but the raccoon clung to him, claws digging into his jacket instead of fighting free. By the time they reached the porch, both were soaked and shivering. Luke carried it inside, set it carefully by the stove, and wrapped a ragged quilt around its body. The animal didn't resist. It just lay there, sides heaving, eyes half closed. Emily arrived before dawn, headlights sweeping the walls. She had come because she couldn't shake the unease of that scar she'd seen the day before. When she stepped inside and saw the raccoon curled in the quilt, she gasped softly. "Oh, Luke, what happened?" "Trap in the gully," he said, voice rough from shouting all night. "Storm spooked her, thought I'd lost her." Emily knelt, examining the leg with careful hands. The raccoon twitched but didn't strike. That alone surprised her. "She let you carry her?" Luke nodded. Didn't seem to have a choice. Or maybe... He hesitated, looking at the animal. "Maybe she decided I wasn't the enemy anymore." Emily cleaned the wound, murmuring softly as she worked. The raccoon winced, but held still, eyes fixed on Luke like he was the only anchor in the room. Ben Walker showed up later, drawn by the storm damage, and maybe by worry he wouldn't admit. When he saw Luke holding the raccoon steady for Emily, something flickered in his face, respect, or at least less scorn than before. "Looks like she's claimed you, boy," he said, leaning on the doorframe. "Or maybe you claimed each other." Luke didn't answer. He just stroked the damp fur gently, the animals trembling, easing under his touch. The storm cleared by midday, sunlight pouring over the wet fields. Outside, everything smelled new, washed clean. Inside, Luke sat with the raccoon on his lap, both of them worn but breathing easier. He felt the shift deep in his chest, a bond forged not in laughter or food scraps, but in pain survived together. Later that evening, as shadows stretched long across the yard, Luke carried the raccoon out to the porch. The air was cool, the hills steaming where the rain had soaked them. He set the animal down gently, half expecting it to dart off into the trees. Instead, it limped to the edge of the step, looked back at him, and settled into the crook of the railing. Luke sat beside it, exhaustion settling into his bones. "Guess you're sticking around," he said softly. The raccoon tilted its head, eyes brighter now, and gave a small sound that was less hiss than hum. For the first time since he had lifted that cage at the auction, Luke didn't wonder if he had made a mistake. He only wondered what story lay behind those scars, and what storms, past and still to come, they would have to weather together. The week after the storm, the hills grew quiet again. Spring water trickled through the gullies, and the meadow grass bent under the weight of morning dew. Luke thought maybe things would return to some kind of ordinary rhythm, but he was wrong. Nothing about the raccoon sitting on his porch railing, tail flicking, eyes sharp, was ordinary. Emily came by that morning, a satchel of instruments slung over her shoulder. "Told you I'd bring the scanner," she said, brushing damp hair from her forehead. She greeted the raccoon with a smile, though she kept her movements careful. "Let's see what you're hiding, little bandit." Luke lifted the animal gently, surprised again at how little fight it gave him now. He could still feel the faint tremor of nerves in its muscles, but its claws stayed tucked. Emily ran the handheld scanner along its neck and shoulders. At first, nothing. Then the machine chirped, a sound too bright for the solemn moment. "There's something here," Emily whispered. She parted the fur, fingers brushing the scar they'd seen before. "It's not just a wound. Something was placed under the skin." The raccoon wriggled, but Luke steadied it, speaking in the low, calm tone he'd used that stormy night. "Easy now. We're not going to hurt you." Emily retrieved a small kit from her bag. "I can make a small incision, right here on the porch." Just a quick cut to see. Luke's chest tightened. He didn't want the creature to suffer another blade. But when he looked into its dark, watchful eyes, he felt something like permission, as though it understood this was necessary. "Do it," he said. The procedure took minutes, though every second dragged. Emily's hands were steady, practiced. At last, she lifted something small and metallic from the wound, a sliver of steel with numbers etched into its side. She held it up, her eyes wide. "Luke, this is no ordinary chip. This is military-grade identification." The raccoon shook its head hard, chittering low as if even the memory of that foreign thing still clung to its skin. Luke stroked its back, anger rising hot in his throat. Somebody did this on purpose. As if on cue, the crunch of tires rolled up the driveway. Sheriff Miller climbed out of his cruiser, hat pulled low against the sun. He spotted the small object in Emily's hand and swore under his breath. "So it's true." Luke rose to his feet. "You knew something." The sheriff looked troubled, older than he had a week before. "I didn't know for certain, but there have been whispers about a private outfit running tests, training wild animals for things that don't belong in polite conversation." He rubbed his jaw. Folks in town didn't want to believe it. Easier to say it was just stories. Emily handed him the tag. "These numbers mean something. We need to find out what." The sheriff pocketed it, his eyes flicking to the raccoon, who now sat at Luke's boot, calmer than before. "If they know this one slipped through, they won't rest until they get it back." Luke felt his stomach knot. "Then let 'em come." That evening, while Luke worked in the shop, the raccoon proved again just how clever it was. He'd left the back door ajar, and by the time he returned, half a loaf of bread was gone, crumbs trailing across the counter like footprints. The animal perched smugly on the pantry shelf, paws covered in flour, face dusted white like a thief caught red-handed. Luke leaned against the doorway, shaking his head. "You break into more places than I can fix." The raccoon tilted its head, then tossed a piece of crust at him as if daring him to join in the crime. For a moment, Luke almost forgot the weight of what Emily and the sheriff had uncovered. But later that night, when the farmhouse lay quiet, he found himself staring at the tag Emily had left on the table. The numbers glinted in the lamplight. Whatever story lay behind them wasn't just about an animal. It was about people willing to twist and break life for power or profit. The raccoon crept up onto the table, curling itself into a ball near his arm. Luke reached out and brushed a hand across its fur. The scar under his fingers told him this little creature carried more history than most men. Outside, the hills were still, but Luke couldn't shake the sheriff's words. If they know this one slipped through. He blew out the lamp, listening to the raccoon's steady breathing. Trouble was coming. He could feel it, but he also knew one thing with unshakable certainty. Whatever had been done to this animal, whatever past it carried, they would face the rest together. They came on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day when laundry flaps on the line and a man lets himself believe the world is gentle. Luke was oiling the hinges on the shop door when a black SUV rolled slow up the drive, tires whispering on gravel. Another followed, windows dark as preachers' shoes. The raccoon, sunbathing on the porch rail, sat up straight and went still, the way wild things do when the brush goes silent. Two men stepped out. Suits in the country never look right, and these were cut too neat for a place where mud takes a liking to everything. The shorter one smiled like a salesman who'd gotten your name wrong but hoped you wouldn't mind. The tall one didn't bother smiling at all. "Mr. Harris?" the short one called, strolling halfway to the porch. "Heard you picked up an animal at the county auction. We represent a rehabilitation outfit. We buy unwanted wildlife, provide care, relocation, good work. We'd like to make you an offer." Luke wiped his hands on a rag. "She's not for sale." Everyone says that until they hear the number. The smile brightened, too polished to be human. 200 today. 5 if you can put her in a crate this evening. Cash. The raccoon slid down the rail and tucked itself against Luke's boot, eyes fixed on the men with a narrow, measuring stare that looked uncomfortably like memory. "Not selling," Luke repeated. The tall one spoke for the first time, voice flat, accent from nowhere in particular. "We're helping the county reduce liability. Animal caused trouble before. Folks got scratched. Paperwork says it should be in our custody." Luke folded his arms. "Then you can bring that paperwork with a deputy who knows my name. Till then, you'll leave." The two exchanged a glance. The short one shrugged, as if disappointed in a stubborn child. "We'll be in touch." They weren't in a hurry to go. They took their time turning around, engines idling, dust lazily rising in the late light. When the vehicles finally slid back through the gate, the raccoon climbed Luke's pant leg like a child scaling a father's knee and perched on his thigh, no longer pretending indifference. Luke laid a palm on its back and felt the fine shiver that never quite left. By supper time, word had already reached Ben Walker. He showed up with 2 boards and a look. "Figure your pantry needs armor," he said. He stayed while Luke anchored the boards into studs, telling a story about a fox that once taught him the cost of underestimating a hungry mouth. When he left, he didn't say, "Be careful." He just tightened the gate chain an extra loop and set a spare padlock on the rail. Dusk settled, soft and peach-colored. Emily called to check on the leg. Luke told her about the men, their smooth lies, the cash. She went quiet, the way a river goes deep. "I'll alert the clinic," she said, "and the sheriff. Lock up. Don't be brave. Be smart." "I'll try," he said, knowing full well he'd settle for cautious stubborn. Night took the farm in stages. Crickets tuned up. An owl wrote its name on the dark. Luke did the rounds, shop door, back latch, window catch, and set a heavy mallet by the stove. The raccoon, restless as a weather vane in March, patrolled from kitchen to porch to hall and back again, pausing often to listen with its whole body. Around midnight, it hopped onto the windowsill and stared into the yard, tail loosening, tightening, loosening. The first sound was small, a stone ticking off the porch step. The second was a whisper of leather against wood, then the faint cluck of a gate eased open by someone who didn't know about Ben's extra loop. Luke's breath slowed. He tipped the lamp down to a thumb of flame and moved to the side of the door. The raccoon dropped from the sill and pressed against his shin, not trembling this time, but coiled. They came like bad weather. 3 shapes, dark and careful, moving across the yard with the confidence of men who believe they already own what they've come for. One held a catchpole, the other a plastic crate. The third kept his hands empty, which worried Luke most. The first man stepped onto the porch. The raccoon vanished, quiet as smoke. A heartbeat later, there was a muffled thunk and a hiss, followed by a curse. Luke blinked. The outside faucet had been turned full on, hose dragged across the boards, spigot wedged open with the very mallet he'd left by the stove. Water spurted in a wobbling arc, slapping the man square in the chest and sending him skidding into the rail. A second arc of chaos arrived when the porch broom, knocked from its hook, rolled under the crate man's boot, tripping him forward. The crate flew, clattered and spun, catching the first man at the ankles. He pinwheeled, flailing for the post. Somewhere above eye level, a tin pie pan, liberated from the pantry, sailed off the roof like a silver moon and smacked the third man on the shoulder with a tidy clang. He swore softly and looked up, just in time to get a face full of rainwater from the sagging gutter the raccoon had so thoughtfully bounced on. It would have been funny if the stakes weren't so mean. Luke stepped into the doorway, voice calm but carrying. "I'd call that strike 3. You boys might want to find a different hobby." The tall man straightened, cold fury washing the water from his expression. "You've got no idea what you're meddling with." "I have exactly an idea," Luke said, "and a sheriff who likes to collect trespassers." As if summoned by name, headlights arced across the trees. Sheriff Miller's cruiser turned up the lane without hurry. Another set of lights followed. Ben, in his faded pickup, jaw set like a clamp. The men retreated into the dark, fast and silent now. By the time the sheriff stepped onto the porch, hat pulled low, they were gone. Only wet boards and a spinning crate left as proof of anything. Ben took one look at the hose and the scattered pans and rolled his eyes so hard it was almost a prayer. Miller listened to Luke's plain account, then walked the yard with a patient flashlight. He paused by a set of prints leading back through the gate, knelt, and touched the mud. "Not local boots," he said. "Too smooth, too new." He straightened, gaze settling on Luke. "You all right?" "We are," Luke said. He looked down. The raccoon had reappeared, soaked whiskers shining, posture high as a drum major's. It stood on the threshold between porch and kitchen, broadside to the open night, head high, not hiding, holding. The sheriff nodded at the little sentinel, as if addressing a deputy. "Good work." He turned back to Luke. "They'll try again, and sooner than you like. I'll run a patrol past here evenings. Ben, you mind keeping an ear tuned?" Ben tapped his temple. "Already tuned." He leaned toward the raccoon. "You, ma'am, are a menace, and I say that with admiration." When they'd gone, Luke shut off the hose and righted what could be righted. He wrung water from a towel and used it to blot the raccoon's back, earning an indignant squeak and a sideways smack of the tail. "You started it," he said, smiling despite the hollow under his ribs. "Don't blame me for cleanup." He fixed the gate with a heavier chain. He set a bell on the back door that could be tripped with a thread. He moved the lamp to the floor behind the wood box and left the mallet where a man could find it in the dark, but the house had already been changed by something beyond locks and clever traps. When Luke finally sat in the rocker and the room went still, the raccoon didn't take the quilt box or the work satchel. It walked to the front door, turned a slow circle, and lay down facing the yard. It rested its chin on its paws and didn't blink for a long time. Luke watched the soft rise and fall of its ribs, the way the porch light drew a thin gold line along each whisker. He thought of the tag on the table and the quiet numbers pressed into steel. He thought of men who sell lies and call it mercy. He thought of his father and all the ways a life teaches you to stand your ground. "You don't owe me a thing," he said into the hush, "but I'm grateful." The raccoon's ear flicked, no more acknowledgement than a soldier gives a nod. Out beyond the gate, a coyote yipped, thin and far. The little guardian lifted its head, listened, and then settled again, as if to say, "I will wake you if it matters." By dawn, the yard looked ordinary again, just wet boards and a broom propped back where it belonged. The SUV tracks had softened under a pearly mist. Luke brewed coffee, the kettle steady as a heartbeat. When he opened the door to let the morning in, the raccoon was already there, sitting square in the entry, back straight, eyes bright. It didn't ask for food or mischief. It simply held the door with him, as if the keeping of that threshold, this house, this small, stubborn life, was now a job they shared. By the time October rolled around, the town was dressing itself for the harvest fair. Stalls went up on the courthouse square, strings of orange bulbs draped across awnings, and the smell of kettle corn drifted on every breeze. It was the kind of event where folks forgot their grudges long enough to trade pies and pumpkins, where children darted like minnows between booths while fiddles played. Luke hadn't planned on going, but Emily insisted. "People are talking," she told him as she stacked baked goods into her truck bed. "Better they see you with the raccoon than listen to rumors from folks who weren't there." Ben had weighed in too, in his gruff way. Town needs to see truth with its own eyes. A critter like that don't belong to shadows. He'd even whittled a sturdier crate, not for keeping the animal locked, but for travel. So Luke found himself on a Saturday morning carrying the raccoon into the square, its ringed tail trailing through the slats as it peered out with bright, calculating eyes. Children squealed and pointed. Some laughed, some pulled back, and more than one parent muttered about fool notions. Luke bore it steady, nodding to those who met his gaze, ignoring the rest. The fair unfolded easy enough at first. Emily sold out her pumpkin bread in an hour. Ben judged the pie contest with his usual grumble, and the raccoon, released at Luke's side, occupied itself by nosing through popcorn bags dropped in the grass. It was playful mischief, the sort that earned giggles when it tried to wear a paper cup like a hat. But midway through the afternoon, as fiddlers soared through turkey in the straw, Luke saw them, two of the same men who had come to his farm, now dressed plain, weaving through the crowd. Their eyes found the raccoon quick as hawks. One of them raised his hand, calling, "That animal belongs to us." His voice carried, cutting through music and chatter. The square stilled. Folks turned, confusion spreading like a ripple on water. Sheriff Miller, standing by the cider stand, was at Luke's side in 3 strides. "Not today," he said flatly. "You got papers? Show them." The man smiled, the same cold curl Luke remembered from his porch. "We don't need papers. That's government property." Emily stepped forward, her voice clear. "Government property doesn't bleed under a surgeon's knife just to hide a metal tag." She pulled a small envelope from her bag, holding up the evidence they'd removed days before. This is what they put inside her. Ask yourself why. A murmur spread through the crowd. People leaned in, whispering, eyes shifting between Luke, the raccoon at his boots, and the suited men. Then the commotion hit. A child, running with a caramel apple, stumbled near the pony ride. A startled horse reared, harness jingling, hooves striking dangerously close to the little girl who'd fallen. Gasps cut the air, too far for anyone to reach in time, except the raccoon. In a blur of grey fur and striped tail, it bounded across the grass, chittering loud enough to startle the horse sideways. Claws flashed, not at the child, but at the dangling rope of the harness, yanking it just enough to free the strap caught under a hoof. The horse spun away harmlessly, while the raccoon planted itself between the girl and danger, tail bristled, teeth bared not in malice but protection. The girl sat frozen, wide-eyed, until the raccoon turned and nudged her gently with its nose. She scrambled up, sobbing, and clung to her mother, who had rushed over with tears streaming down her own cheeks. The square erupted, not in fear this time, but applause. Cheers, whistles, shouts of astonishment. "Did you see that?" someone cried. "Saved her," shouted another. "Smartest critter I ever laid eyes on." The two suited men tried to press their claim again, but now the crowd closed against them. Sheriff Miller planted himself square in their path, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, though he never drew it. "Best you get on out of here," he said, voice low but iron strong. This town's made its mind up. The men backed off, faces tight, retreating through jeers they couldn't silence. Luke knelt, scooping the raccoon into his arms. It didn't struggle. It simply looked at him, whiskers twitching, chest still heaving from the run. For a moment, Luke thought he saw pride there, plain and human as any soldier returning from a charge. Emily touched his shoulder, voice thick with awe. They'll never call her trash again, not after this. Ben joined them, hat in his hands, shaking his head. "Well, I'll be. Guess I was wrong about you, Bandit." He reached out, rough fingers brushing the raccoon's back like a benediction. "You've earned your place." As dusk painted the square in amber light, the fiddles struck up once more. But the tune sounded different now, charged with the kind of hope a community feels when it's seen something bigger than fear. People gathered closer around Luke, asking questions, offering thanks, snapping photographs as though to fix the moment in time. Luke stood a little taller, the raccoon perched on his shoulder like a defiant banner. The jeers of the auction hall felt like years ago. This was no rejected animal anymore. This was a protector, a symbol, and, against all odds, his friend. Still, in the corner of the square, Luke noticed a stranger watching, not clapping, not speaking, just watching with a gaze too steady to be casual. When their eyes met, the man slipped into the crowd and was gone. Luke's hand tightened gently on the raccoon's fur. The day had given them triumph, but the war behind the scar was not finished. Trouble was still circling. He could feel it like thunder on the far side of the hills. But tonight, in the glow of lanterns and laughter, with the whole town bearing witness, he let himself breathe. For once, the world had seen the raccoon as he did, not as a burden but as a chance. The fair changed everything, though at first it only felt like a nicer walk down Main Street. Folks who'd once crossed to the other side now tipped their hats, pressed a slice of pie into Luke's hand, or bent to speak to the raccoon like she was a neighbor's child. Emily said news traveled faster than gossip when it carried a little hope. Ben called it plain proof, which, coming from him, was nearly poetry. Sheriff Miller wasn't one for poetry. He filed reports, sent that metal tag up the line, and started a paper trail thick as winter quilts. The stranger Luke had noticed at the fair turned out to be a junior technician from the company, nerves and conscience both frayed. Under oath, he spilled the lot. How wild animals had been captured, tagged, and pushed past fear in the name of behavioral conditioning. He had quit the week before the fair and come looking for someone who'd listen. He found a town ready to listen. There were hearings in a courthouse that smelled of varnish and history. Luke didn't say much, and neither did the raccoon, who waited in the hallway in a travel crate Ben had sanded smooth as a hymn. Emily presented photographs and notes, calm but fierce. The sheriff laid out the timeline, and the technician filled in the ugly seams. When it was done, the judge's gavel came down with a sound that felt like a door shutting on a long, mean wind. Warrants followed. So did fines, injunctions, and federal eyes that don't blink. All that was thunder on the horizon. Back home, life made a quieter kind of noise. Hammers, mostly. Ben hauled lumber, grumbling the whole way, and Luke turned the old tobacco barn into something gentler. They framed small rooms with low doors, added skylights like open palms, and lined the walls with cedar that gave the air a clean, steady smell. Emily designed enclosures that let wild hearts keep their dignity. She drew chalk lines on the floor and made the men move the walls twice, then thanked them with apples and coffee that tasted of forgiveness. They named it modestly, a sanctuary, not a miracle. Paperwork takes the shine off everything, but the town helped shine it back. The cafe brought day-old rolls that tasted fresh when warmed. The feed store donated bales. Kids came with hand-lettered signs and jars of pennies. The church ladies stitched quilts and pretended not to see Luke's eyes get wet when he unfolded the first one and found his father's initials sewn in a corner, copied from the stamp he used on finished chairs. Through it all, the raccoon lived her double life, half foreman, half rascal. She inspected every board, tapped screws with a paw, and scolded Ben when he set his tape measure down where she wanted to nap. She stole the sheriff's hat clean off his head one afternoon, raced to the rafters with it, and peered over the edge while he stood below with his hands on his hips and a smile trying to escape. When she finally dropped the hat, she did it just so it landed crown down on the sheriff like a magician's trick. He doffed it to her and said, "Ma'am," and everyone laughed until the rafters shook. At night, when the saws went quiet, she kept her other job. She sat on the porch and listened for trouble that didn't come, her chin on her paws and her tail curled like punctuation. Sometimes she crept into town with Luke and Emily for supplies, riding in the passenger seat like a lady out for air. She learned the route to the bakery by heart and tried 3 separate times to open the back door with a bent spoon she'd claimed from Luke's sink. The third time, Mrs. Garland at the counter gave up, propped the door, and handed over a day-old cinnamon roll the size of a skillet. "For the hero," she said. The raccoon accepted the compliment and then hid half the roll in a flower pot, because heroes must plan for lean days. When the sanctuary finally opened, there was no ribbon cutting and no speeches, just a line of trucks nose to tail up the lane. A possum with a limp, a fox tangled with fishing line, a stray cat who had decided she was wild only to rethink it in November. The raccoon watched each arrival with a solemnity that made the children quiet. She walked the fence, sniffed the air, and took her post by the door. If worry tried to climb the hill, it would have to pass through her. They were not saints. They were tired. They made mistakes. Luke measured a brace twice and still cut it wrong. Emily snapped once from lack of sleep and cried behind the tool shed where no one could see. Ben cursed a stuck hinge until it gave, and then apologized to it, which was something to witness. The raccoon dragged the sheriff's hat into a water trough and then stared into the ripples at a stranger staring back, and Luke saw in the tilt of her head the same question that lived in him. "Who am I now?" They answered together, day by day. Luke set out breakfast on the porch, and the raccoon showed up like clockwork, standing to wash her paws in the bowl as if manners were a decision. When Luke tried to name her, nothing stuck. He tried Bandit, then Madam, then Scout. Emily said, "You don't choose a name like that. It chooses you." It chose on a windy Sunday. A pickup sputtered to a stop by the mailbox, and a family stepped out. A mother with worry lines, a boy with eyes set on the ground, a girl clutching a stuffed rabbit so tight the seams cried. They'd found a coonhound caught in a culvert and hauled him out with a rope and faith. The dog was shaking, the boy more so. The raccoon came to the porch edge and sat, tail loose, head cocked. She didn't reach for the dog or push at the boy's boots. She just waited until they looked up. Then she stood, padded down the steps, and pressed her nose to the boy's knuckles the way you might greet someone who'd come a long way to tell the truth. The boy smiled, a small thing, but it lit his mother's face like morning. Luke looked at Emily, and Emily looked at Luke, and Ben, standing behind them, with his arms folded like a barn door, cleared his throat. "Well," he said, which in Ben meant a paragraph. "There it is." Luke knelt, and the raccoon turned as if she'd been called. "Chance," he said softly, the word landing like a penny in a wishing well. "If you'll have it." The raccoon blinked, then hopped onto his knee and patted his chest twice, a little drummer striking up a march. Chance it was, and the name fit so clean it was as if she'd been wearing it all along. Winter pressed close and then eased. The hearings moved from page 2 to page 6, and then out of the paper altogether. Trucks still came, and so did town kids with carrots and questions, and once, because life tries to pay its debts, a woman from the company, the technician's supervisor, came alone. She stood at the fence in a coat too thin for the wind and said, "I'm sorry," to no one in particular. Luke nodded. Emily nodded. Chance trotted over, studied the woman's hands, and then climbed the fence picket by picket as if that were the most natural path between past and present. She tucked a small, warm paw against the woman's wrist and left it there until the woman's shoulders shook and she laughed and cried in the same breath. Late one afternoon, Luke found an old box in the shop he hadn't opened since his father died. Inside was a battered shop apron and a note in his father's square hand. "If you ever forget what to do, start by fixing something smaller than your heart." Luke folded the note into his pocket. That evening, he fixed the wobbly step on the porch, Chance supervised with great seriousness, then ruined the solemnity by stealing a nail from his palm and hiding it in Ben's boot. When Ben discovered it, he declared, "Sabotage," and Chance chittered so hard she fell over. They didn't call the sanctuary a success. They called it Open Tomorrow. The sign out front was plain, Sanctuary for Forgotten Wildlife. Below it, in smaller letters, someone, Emily very likely, had painted, "Every heart gets a second try." The paint was barely dry when the first snow came, feathering the roof and laying a hush over the hill. Luke stood at the door with a broom, sweeping a path. Chance sat beside him, flicking snow off her whiskers, stealing his cap, handing it back when his ears turned red. He thought of the auction barn, of laughter that bit like cold, of the words not worth a dime. He thought of Emily's steady hands and Ben's stubborn, Sheriff Miller's compass, and a town that remembered how to stand for something. He thought of Chance, once a scar with fur, now a small, troublesome beacon, and felt the odd, grateful ache of a life mended in visible stitches. "Come on," he said, setting the broom aside. "Let's go check the bins in town before Mrs. Garland throws you out for breaking and entering." Chance perked up at the word bins, hopped into the truck, and sat prim as a pastor's wife until Luke turned the key. They rumbled down the lane, past the gate that didn't need guarding, under a sky the color of tin. At the stop sign, Chance tapped his sleeve and offered him his own cap, the one she'd just stolen from the peg by the door. He put it on and laughed, a sound that didn't echo this time because it didn't need to. The road into town was lined with bare sycamores and the quiet grace of fields at rest. Somewhere behind them a bell clanged at the sanctuary door, and Ben's voice carried a mile if it carried an inch. "Hold your horses, I'm coming." Luke glanced at Chance and said, "You know, folks think you changed this town." Chance tilted her head as if to say, "And what do you think?" "I think," Luke answered, "you reminded us we could change ourselves." She reached across the bench seat, patted his shoulder twice, and then, because mischief is a kind of mercy, stuck her nose in the bakery bag and came up wearing a paper crown. Mrs. Garland would fuss, then laugh, then hand over 2 cinnamon rolls. One would go into Chance's belly, the other would go into a flower pot for later, because hope is sweeter when you leave some for tomorrow. The truck rolled on, and the town rose ahead, ordinary and shining. Chance set her paws on the dash to watch it come, her name fitting the air like it had always lived there. And if anyone asked what happened next, Luke could have told them plain. A rejected raccoon was bought by a young man, and what happened next moved everyone. First a little, then a lot, until the moving made room for more. And now it's your turn. If this story touched you, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments below. It's that easy. I'd love to see you there. And don't forget to hit subscribe, because the next story might just move you even more than this one.